Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our event here at the Stephansplatz. Very happy to see you all here. And I want to welcome our Vice Rector, Maria Taschel-Erber. She is responsible for the interreligious and the religions in our University College, and I want to ask her please to say a few words in the beginning.
Thank you for the introduction. But I'm starting in German, a little bit switching of languages. Ja, ich möchte Sie alle ganz herzlich begrüßen als Vizerektorin für religiöse Bildung und interreligiösen Dialog zu diesem Event, wo wir uns freuen, dass das jetzt nach doch einiger Zeit möglich geworden ist, trotz dieser Pandemie, in der wir schon gewohnt sind zu leben. Lehren und Lernen über den Nationalsozialismus und Holocaust stellt eine wichtige Aufgabe dar in der Aus-, Fort- und Weiterbildung an der Kirchlichen Pädagogischen Hochschule Wien-Krems. Dies zeigt sich mitunter darin, dass sich seit einigen Jahren hier ein Arbeitsschwerpunkt mit dem Fokus auf Erinnerungslernen, Holocaust Education, herausgebildet hat, der seither einen zentralen Angelpunkt in Forschung und Lehre an der KPH darstellt. Spezielle Expertise dafür wurde, abgesehen vom Institut Jüdische Religion, aufgebaut im Kompetenzzentrum für interkulturelles, interreligiöses und interkonfessionelles Lernen, das als Mitveranstalter hier auftritt, sowie im Kompetenzzentrum für Menschenrechtspädagogik. Ein bedeutendes Ziel der Initiativen in diesem Bereich ist es unter anderem, zu einer Erinnerungskultur beizutragen, die über die Katastrophen der Geschichte in adäquater Weise informiert und diese kritisch reflektiert und damit nicht nur den Opfern der Shoah und ihren Nachkommen gerecht zu werden, sofern man das je kann, sondern auch den vermehrt auftretenden antisemitischen Tendenzen innerhalb der Gesellschaft entsprechend gegenzusteuern. Das kollektive Gedächtnis ist ein bedeutender Faktor für die Bewältigung der Gegenwart und auch der Zukunft. In diesem Zusammenhang ist im Bereich der Holocaust Education die Arbeit mit Biografien, sowohl auf Seiten der Opfer als auch der Täter und Täterinnen, unerlässlich. Und gerade am besten im Dialog. Die heutige Buchbesprechung von der Ratline mit anschließender Podiumsdiskussion stellt einen wichtigen Beitrag zur Auseinandersetzung mit der Bedeutung von Familiennarrativen dar, sowie einer angemessenen Kultur des Erinnerns. Am Beispiel des von Philippe im Jahr 2020 veröffentlichten Buch The Ratline, Sie sehen hinten einige Exemplare, kann veranschaulicht werden, wie Nachkommen von Nationalsozialisten mit der Vergangenheit umgehen, wie sie diese bewältigen und wie diese in ihrem Einfluss auf unsere Gesellschaft bis heute und in die Zukunft wirkt bzw. wirken kann. Traumatisierungen von Opfern und TäterInnen wirken auch über die Generationen hinweg auf das Handeln der Einzelnen und der Gesellschaft. In diesem Zusammenhang geht es nicht nur um eine Auseinandersetzung mit der Frage nach individueller Schuld, sondern explizit auch um das Benennen, die kritische Reflexion der Ereignisse bis hin zur Übernahme von Verantwortung in einer Gesellschaft, der das Erinnern immer wieder in Erinnerung gerufen werden muss. Vor allem auch je leiser die Stimme der Zeitzeugen und Zeitzeuginnen wird und angesichts aktueller Verschwörungstheorien. Daher ist es unser aller bildungspolitischer Auftrag für heute, jeder Form des Antisemitismus und Antijudaismus in Lehre und Forschung, wo wir hier dieses akademische Setting haben, eine Absage zu erteilen. Maßnahmen zu setzen in Aus-, Fort- und Weiterbildung im Bereich der Holocaust Education und damit auch an der KPH Wien-Krems einen entsprechenden Beitrag zu leisten zu einer angemessenen und auf Zukunft hin ausgerichteten Erinnerungskultur. Ich danke ganz herzlich dem Kompetenzzentrum für interkulturelles, interreligiöses Lernen, für die Organisation der Veranstaltung. Leiterin sitzt hier, Elis Luczensky. Ich danke Philippe Sands für sein Kommen, den Teilnehmern und Teilnehmerinnen am Podium. Hier Awi Blumenfeld vom Institut Jüdische Religion. Auf der anderen Seite Georg Stanfel. Herzlichen Dank für die Initiative zu dieser Veranstaltung. Und daneben seine Frau Friderica Wächter Stanfel. Ja, ich freue mich, dass Sie alle hier gemeinsam sitzen. Das ist so dieses Brückenbauen, dieses Building Bridges hier an unserer Hochschule, das uns auszeichnet. Und bedanke mich nicht zuletzt natürlich beim Autor, der uns diesen Nachmittag und frühen Abend überhaupt ermöglicht hat. Ganz herzlichen Dank.
Thank you very much for the introductional words. I also want to welcome Andreas Weissenbeck. He's also vice rector from University College. And I also want to say again thank you to Elis Luczensky from our interreligious group. I don't know in English exactly what it means. There's a lot of ease in it, but anyway, thank you very much for the organization. Yes, I want to a short introduction to the people that you see here. I start not because she's my wife, but she's on the very right side here. Friderica Magdalena Wächter Stanfel. She was born in Kava in New Zealand. Why, she will maybe tell us later. She grew up in Austria, in Italy, and in Sweden. She studied painting in the Academy of Fine Arts of Vienna and finished it there. Also now she's in the education of a life advisor in the Clayfield therapy, let's call it like this. Yes, and the rest she will tell us. Then beside her, Philippe Sands, born in London, barrister, lawyer, University of London. He's a lecturer professor there. He's a lawyer for international law in international courts like in Den Haag, in European Court for Human Rights, in other courts, the Court of Investigation and the International Court of Sport. In the moment, also, as far as I know, he's working in the ecocide law to find law things against economic and environment crimes. Maybe he will tell us more about this a little bit. And he has also roots from Vienna because his grandfather comes from Vienna. So there's also a connection to here. His two books, East-West Street and The Ratline, are I think the main content of this day, this afternoon, and then we will go into this theme later. And beside him, Awi Blumenfeld, also from the KPG, the director of the Institute of Jewish Religion. He's historian, born in Munich. He's a counselor for the Israeli government and the German government, and he's specialized in Holocaust research. And he's the director of the Jewish Institute, and many other things. If I have forgotten something, please you tell us. Yes, and I wanted to start with Philippe.
The Ratline is the second book. Mention has been made of the first, East-West Street. East-West Street tells really the story of four men. One of them was my grandfather. He was born in Lemberg in 1904, moved to Vienna in 1914, and I knew him very well. He lived until 1997. He left Vienna in 1939 with my mother, who was then 1 year old. She followed, in fact, as those of you who've read East-West Street will know, a few months later by herself in curious circumstances. And they all survived, as did my grandmother, who was actually born in Vienna. I arrived in 1960, and my grandfather was basically for me a Frenchman. And he never talked to me about what had happened. He never talked about Vienna. He never talked about Lemberg. Last night we did an event. I see Monica Gressler from the Freud Museum, a remarkable event last night with the novelist Esther Freud, the daughter of the celebrated painter Lucien Freud, who also grew up in a household in which no one talked about what had happened. In 2010, I get an invitation to give a lecture in the University of Lviv Law Faculty on the cases that I do as a lawyer on crimes against humanity and genocide, mass murder. I do a lot of those cases because there's a lot of mass murder. And I prepared to go to Lviv, Lemberg, and I was astonished as I wrote my lecture and researched what I would talk about. The man who invented the concept of crimes against humanity in international law, Hersch Lauterpacht, who studied here at the University of Vienna. I just went this morning to the marvellous exhibit at the Jewish Museum on Hans Kelsen, who is the originator of Austria's remarkable constitution, the first ever constitution to give rights of individuals to petition a constitutional court for the violations of their rights. Hersch Lauterpacht came from Lviv, studied at the law school that had invited me, the people didn't know it. And then I discovered that the man who invented the concept of genocide, which is concerned not with the protection of individuals, but the protection of groups, had also studied at the law faculty in Lviv, and no one there knew about that either. So I started writing a book about those three characters, Leon, Lauterpacht, Lemkin, and into the story came a fourth man, which is, I think, the introduction to how I came to know Friderica Magdalena, Hans Frank, Governor-General of Nazi-occupied Poland, based in Krakow. And he became the glue in the book, because it was he who was hanged at Nuremberg exactly 75 years ago for the murder of 4 million human beings, 3 million Jews and 1 million Poles. And amongst those 4 million were Lauterpacht's entire family, Lemkin's entire family, and my grandfather's entire family that had been left behind in Lemberg. When I do research, maybe because I'm an academic, maybe because I'm a lawyer, I leave no stone unturned. And in researching Hans Frank, I came across a remarkable book by a man called Nicholas Frank, who's the son of one of the children of Hans Frank. And I got to know him very well. In 2011, he said to me, Philippe, you're interested in Lemberg. Your family is from Lemberg. Would you like to meet the son of the gouverneur of Lemberg, an Austrian, Otto Wächter, who was first, well, he was many things. I don't have time to go through his long curriculum vitae, but you will be very familiar that he was an early proponent of Nazism. He led the coup attempt in 1934 to remove the government of Chancellor Dollfuss. He fled to Berlin. He worked then in the office of the Sicherdienst of the SS and came into the circle of Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, Heinrich Himmler. On the 15th of March 1938, he stood on the balcony of the Heldenplatz. His wife, Charlotte Wächter, Magdalena, Frederica Magdalena's grandmother, who I think she may say something about, describes in her memoirs standing on the balcony with the Führer. She writes about it again 40 years later and describes it as the single greatest day of her life. For 9 years I have looked for photographs of Otto Wächter on the balcony with the Führer. And 4 weeks ago, from New Zealand, finally a photo emerged, and I'll show it tonight for the first time in Vienna at the lecture that I'm giving at the MAK. The proximity speaks very loudly. His first job from April 1938 was the removal of all Jews from public office. At least 16,500 individuals. I've written a bit about this when we come back to this later on. He did his work well, it seems, and he was remunerated with appointment as governor of Krakow. He is the man who authorized the construction and functioning of the Krakow ghetto, known for holding many people. And in February 1942, he was sent to District Galicia to oversee the implementation of the final solution. He did that with brutal efficiency. More than 500,000 human beings were killed in the space of a matter of months. And in July 1944, when the Red Army occupied Lemberg, and it became once more Lviv, he fled. And I tell in the first part of the story his professional career, but also the love story between him and his spouse, Charlotte. But it's the second part of the story which I think is possibly the most unique. On the 9th of May 1945, he disappeared off the face of the earth, and no one really knew what had happened. He re-emerged 4.5 years later in the Santo Spirito Hospital in Rome, a Vatican-run institution, where he was supported by the well-known Austrian bishop, Alois, who had essentially operated with the support of others, as I discovered, the Americans, the British, others in the Vatican, various Nazis and fascists, something called the Ratline, the Reich migratory path that leads to South America, the escape route for those who had been enmeshed in crimes. Nicholas introduced me to Horst, and I want to say at the outset, I want to express my gratitude to Horst. We have very different views about what happened, and we have very different views about the role of his father. When I first was introduced to him by Nicholas said, one thing you need to know about Nicholas is that Nicholas is not a fan of his own father. When I met Nicholas for the first time, he said to me, Philippe, you have to understand, I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father. He deserved to die. He was a criminal. But when you meet Horst, you will see that Horst has a different view. He looks to find the good in his father. Fine, I said, and we came to know each other. And one thing led to another. I wrote a profile of Horst in the Financial Times, which got a lot of attention. That then caused a commission for the famous BBC Storyville documentary series, and the three of us made a film together, My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did. Horst also has a good sense of humour, wrote to me on numerous occasions and said the film had the wrong title. It should have been called My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did and Did Not Do. In the course of filming, and it was Horst's idea to go in July when Otto Wächter's Waffen-SS Galicia division would be celebrated. And I have to say it is one of the most horrendous days of my life to find myself in a field with hundreds of people running around in Waffen-SS uniforms, celebrating what was done in that period. We filmed it, you can all see it for yourself, it's available on Apple Films and Amazon and whatever. Nicholas was appalled, even more appalled than I was. And in an interview the next day, on camera, he said, I think Horst is a Nazi. I disagreed. I do not think Horst is a Nazi. I do not think Horst is a Holocaust denier. He's not a racist. He's not an anti-Semite. He insisted on Lublasa. He was always very generous with me, very open. We always spoke very frankly about things, whatever our differences were. And nevertheless, Nicholas maintained his position, although he has subsequently retracted. This episode went into the film, and Horst was, understandably, rather upset by this scene, and he asked me, what can I do to prove that I'm not a Nazi? And I eventually came up with the following idea. I had learned by then that Horst held, and you can say no doubt more about this, a truly remarkable family archive. More than 10,000 pages of diaries and letters and postcards and photographs from the day Charlotta and Otto met in the train station here, Westbahnhof, in Vienna, to the day he died, on the 13th of July 1949, 20 years, 1929 to 1949. Why, I said, don't you give all of this extraordinary archival material to a museum? Nazis tend not to do that sort of thing. He said, that's a terrific idea. And which museum? And I said, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, because they'll digitize it and they'll make it available easily. He said, terrific, and it was done. And I absolutely respect and honour what Horst has done. This material is utterly unique. It is the only collection that is known of a top table Nazi that documents the inner private life of people who sat at the top table. It is all now publicly available, thanks to Horst, on the website of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. You can type in Wächter Archive USHMO and you'll get all the letters, all the diaries, absolutely everything, except the sound recordings, which are pretty amazing. But those, I think, are going to be put on. And then Horst said, would you like a copy? And I said, sure, I'd love a copy. And 2 weeks later, in a it's quite ecological, it's a recycled envelope, popped through my door with a single USB stick, and I put it in my computer, and I was amazed by what I saw. It is astonishing material. And I spent 4.5 years with researchers, PhD students and others, to the highest standards of scholarship, translating, interpreting, joining the dots, filling the gaps, comparing with publicly available documents. And that's the story of the Ratline. And what emerges, I think, is the first account of how someone who tried to get from Europe to Argentina went about their business. The networks, who helped, how it worked, the paths followed, the places stayed, the individuals connected. It was a huge amount of research because Otto and Charlotta, who wrote to each other at least 2 or 3 times a week while he was on the run in this later period, wrote in code because they worried that the military censors were reading their letters. So Hudar, for example, is never referred to. The reference is to the religious gentleman. And we had to work out who the religious gentleman was. We had to work out who was the person with whom Otto Wächter met on the weekend of the 2nd and 3rd of July 1949 in Lake Albano, the old SS, the old comrade. Who was the old comrade? We worked out to 100% certainty who the old comrade was, another Nazi mass murderer, who had been recruited unbelievably by the Americans to help recruit Nazis against the new enemy. And so it segues extraordinarily into a story which is shocking at another level. And that is that by 1949, with the arrival of the Cold War, the British, the Americans, Nazis, fascists in Italy, and the Vatican, elements in the Vatican, were engaged in an alliance against the new enemy, the Soviets, the Bolsheviks. Cold War had descended with vengeance, and the book tells that story. I won't give anything more away. Let me just conclude by saying a few words about silence, which is our main theme, I think. I grew up in a family of silence, as I've already mentioned. My brother and I never asked any questions to our grandparents or to our mother. We were told not to. Too painful. Don't go there. It was only in meeting Nicholas and Horst that I came to learn for the first time, and by now I was in my early 50s, that there was a parallel silence on the other side of the story. And I've become absolutely fascinated by that silence. And I've become fascinated by the interactions that I've had with Nicholas and Horst, precisely because I've been able now to understand. But even more importantly, I think, for going forward, and of course I'm very attached to the principle that children and grandchildren bear no responsibility for the acts of their parents. They are not in any way responsible. What they are responsible for is to talk honestly and openly about what has happened. And that I've been greatly assisted, and I may pay tribute to Friderica Magdalena by getting to know the next generation. Because I think it is only in the next generation, with you and with Francesca Frank, the daughter of Nicholas Frank, the granddaughter of Hans Frank, that we've really been able to have honest conversations about what happened and how do we move on from this? How do we reconcile? How do we build on a terrible legacy? And I'm going to end, not because I wish to be controversial. I think people know how much time I've spent in Austria, my very good feelings when I'm here, and the sense of respect that I have for so many friends and academic colleagues here. But I'm just going to speak very personally and say this. I came to Vienna for the first time in 1988. I came to work at the International Atomic Energy Agency on Chernobyl-related matters. And the moment I set foot in Austria for the first time, because of course it was a place growing up that one could not go to because of our family history, I was very pleased to come and finally try and find my grandparents' house and all these kinds of things. I felt uncomfortable. And I felt uncomfortable in a different way from any other place that I'd been. In Germany, when I was in Berlin, I didn't feel uncomfortable. I felt somewhat at ease and able not to think so much about what had happened. And I've come to understand that from my perspective and my experience, and I appreciate different people have different experiences, I don't have the sense that there has been a full engagement in Austria with what has happened. And it's getting to know Horst and Frederica Magdalena in particular that I've come to understand that the issue has begun in the family. I'm going to leave it to you to talk about family issues. I know that Horst has paid a very big price for engaging as he has with me, and that probably you too have paid a big price for engaging with me. The Wächters produced 23 grandchildren. The only one I'm in contact with, the only one who wishes to have any contact with me is you, and I honour you for that. The others do not wish to have contact with me because they feel I have transgressed by putting the spotlight on issues that are best kept in the shadows. And I respect the right to hold that view absolutely. I do believe that it is misguided, because I do believe these things come back and haunt you over time, and that the better way is to find a way to talk about these things. And that's why I'm so pleased to be here today, having this frank but very respectful and collegial and collaborative conversation, and especially to pay tribute to you for your openness. The last words of the book are spoken by you. With your permission, I could never have put what I wrote at the end of the book in without your permission. And we both knew, I think, that putting those words in the book would cause problems, because you were brutally honest. I respect that brutal honesty, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. Frederick, because you have been addressed now sometimes. The question to you, maybe this Friderica Magdalena thing, because if you read the book, we will find your name as Magdalena there. Maybe you can explain why it's like this. And what was your experience, or how did you experience the content of this family story, of being a part of what Philippe very shortly now had told, and what was the consequences for you personally?
Yes, my name is Magdalena, and this is because my father named me after the Christian saint Mary Magdalene, and this was in a way so that I would atone for the sins of the family, because it's the sinner, you know, Mary Magdalene, the sinner. Yes, and because of this I prefer Friderica, because it has a name peace in it, like Islam and Salam, it's a peace. And it's come from my Christian godfather, Friedensreich Hundertwasser. So I prefer this name. It's more comfortable for me now, but it's also okay to address me as Magdalena. Yes, and this also comes, the whole story with my birth and everything, it starts with my father, because he felt somehow guilty for all this that his father did and his parents so, and he had the feeling he wanted to serve a Jew, and because of he had a friend, Udo Brocksch, who was also from a Nazi family, and he introduced him to Hundertwasser, and so my father worked for Hundertwasser for free, and just for food and shelter. He was a few years his secretary. And then he organized for him the ship, the Regentag, and he was also a skipper with the ship and helped him building the ship. And because it was an old ship, but he was renovating it. And while my father was on the ship of Hundertwasser, he met my mother, because she was working on another ship, who was it was called Meta of Pixelkrök. It was a Swedish ship, because my mother was from Sweden, where Pippi Longstocking was filmed. And so they met on this ship, and then a while ago, after they married, and mostly my parents alone made this. They went from Venice. They went to New Zealand. It took them 1.5 years. And I was conceived on that journey. So I was also born in New Zealand because of this. And after half a year in New Zealand, they returned to Europe, to Austria, where they also lived with my grandmother, I with my parents, which was very difficult for my mother, because my mother was from a complete different family. She was Swedish, from a journalist dynasty. Her father was an important Swedish journalist in Sweden, and who worked in Berlin and became a good friend to Willy Brandt. So he was also more on the left, and he was completely anti-Nazi. And then I think my mother realized how much Nazi my grandmother was. And it was because my grandmother, she constructed a silencing around the family. And she reconstructed the role of my grandfather, so that she always told the children and the family that he was a good Nazi, he was a good person. And so my father heard this all from her. And she switched from a devoted Nazi, from a strict Nazi to a strict Catholic. And I know this because I lived with her for more than 1 or 2 years. And the big problem was also that Charlotte, my grandmother, was the most important person in my father's life, more than my mother. And because of this also they divorced. And I grew up in Italy and in Sweden and Austria. And so it is difficult. And my father, there was always this silencing. You know, my mother was somehow, she felt ashamed to have married into this Nazi family. And my father didn't talk much about it, but sometimes he said, yes, my father was a good person, and my mother and me, we would reply, how could he have been a good person when he was a Nazi? And I only knew he was a high-ranking Nazi, but I didn't know any details. I didn't know when or where. And perhaps because I'm also the youngest of the 23 cousins, nobody talked with me, at least I think, about all of this. And all my life I felt this burden. I somehow felt guilty, but I didn't know really why. And when I was 18 years old, I became severely ill and I was in hospital. And the next 20 years I would struggle with this illness. I was really mentally completely disordered. And then I finished my studies and I raised my children alone, but I couldn't work, and so my financial situation was always critical. And already in my 20s I began psychotherapy, and because the main reason was for me that I didn't want my children to get ill from all the silencing, to get the same as me. And the last 6 years I've been intensively making therapy due to this education I'm making, and it helped me a lot. And the most important, when I really found out how brave it was, I made a systemic family constellation. And that you put someone for you in a group, and then you put all your parents around, and so on. You reconstruct the situation. And the woman who was standing there for me, she suddenly started crying. Really, the tears came out like this, and she didn't know why, but she started. And then we lay down. We thought perhaps there was a burden, and we thought perhaps it's from the children. My grandmother, she aborted 2 or 3 children now, and we put the people down there like dead people, and then they said something is missing, and then they put another one there, and they found out then it's not just this is just the 500,000 victims, the Holocaust from the Shoah, And this was really heavy to see this such a weight, because so many people are involved, and so descendants as well.
Thank you. Awi, now question to you, because not in this family things, you're not involved in these things. You grew up as a descendant of your close family members have been killed in the Holocaust. You live here in this society where these people, if they would still be in power, maybe would have killed you also. You not went to here or there, you're in Israel, but you're working here, you're acting here. What does it do with you or with somebody like you to be among the people, among the descendants of these people in the situation maybe of silence or whatever is going around here?
Thank you very much, and thank you too for the really touching and also inspiring words we had. And it's funny you saying, when you're asking this stuff, as I grew up in Munich in Germany, the town of the movement, or the capital of the movement, the Hauptstadt, which had its own quality. And I remember that deliberately, I'm born, I don't look like, but I'm born 1966. And it was a year after my mitzvah, and I made a decision, a very clear decision. I'm not getting up in the tramway anymore for elderly people. I'm not getting up. I mean, you're educated, you're a good boy, Catholic, Jewish, Chinese, you sit in the tramway, you get up, it's coming over the people. So in the same year, the Green Party was founded, not connected to nowadays politics. And in the German Green Party, there was a guy by the name of Vogel, who was also connected to Peter Kelly, another famous founder of the Greens, and he was a former SS, which was then discovered, and it was a big scandal. And this made the decision, I said, listen, those are the old people here, I don't want to get up in the tramway. Now, there was also this form of silence, what is it called in Hebrew, and it's used also in psychosociological historical context, shtika, quietness, silence. And obviously from different sides, because my mother and my father, who as kids have been in ghettos and camps and Auschwitz and so on, were on the victim's side, and the other side were the perpetrator's side. And nearly no bystanders, because in my eyes at least, everybody was a perpetrator. I grew up like this as a kid, as a Jewish kid, in a community of survivors who were not from Germany. I think 86% of the Jewish community came from Poland. It was always we and them. It's we, and it's them. So how you interact? And when I getting older, and I was in a non-Jewish elementary school and a non-Jewish high school. And of course I had non-Jewish friends. And I see the friends are different. It was very turbulent political times. It was the so-called heiße Herbst, the hot fall, when they were speaking about Pershing and the NATO Doppelbeschluss. And at the same time it was the Lebanon War, 1982. And in the Lebanon War, I heard the first slogans, "You did the same, what the Nazis did to you in the Warsaw Ghetto, you do in Beirut." So there were a few layers of questions. First, why I do the same. I live in Munich, I'm in Bavaria, I'm not in Tel Aviv, so what do you want from me? On the other hand, of course, that's also my country, and then Germany is not my country, and I'm still in this society. Why I'm reflecting so much? Because I think today things changed. I was supposed to be in Tel Aviv. My wife is a Jewish girl from Vienna. Due to family circumstances, she wanted to come back, and I followed her as a good Jewish husband. And I work in this society. And being exposed now, after being 25 years, brutal at least, in Israel, to the Austrian society, who came approximately 40 years later into the process of dealing with the past. I started in Vienna 85, 86. Those were the Waldheim years. And when I came to Vienna, I decided I want to go with my kippah. There were 4 Jewish boys out of the community of then 8,000 who wore kippot on the street. And I was one of them coming from Munich. And society then was totally different than today. And it's thanks to people like Friderica who are making this change in the society. And it's also thanks to people like you, Gary, at the Hochschule. And whether they are Christian or Alevite or Islam or Muslim or even atheists who want to deal with society, to not look in the past, but to concrete shape present and future. So my work is different, and also my feeling is different, because there is no silence anymore. And I think that's a song where there's no silence anymore, I would say, not just in the political correct or in the woke areas of society, because the quiet cry, der stille Schrei, the quiet voice is so loud anymore that you really can't bear it anymore. And Austria paid a heavy price for not dealing with it 40 years, from becoming the first victim to understand, no, I'm not a victim, I'm a perpetrator. The only victim I am a victim of my own deeds and of my own crimes. And I think that's a very strong point. And I find it interesting as people of the second or the third generation, or like Philippe, the second and a half generation, because he's sort of in between, are trying to grasp with the past for the sake of the present and the future. And for this, I think we are doing something new. We're creating a symphony of conversation, of dialogue, of quarreling, but for a better future. And I think that's really amazing what is going on. That's really amazing with the all burden I have in. I mean, when I read the Ratline, you know, it's again, I don't ask my wife anymore why we're here, not in Tel Aviv, but I mean, you know, as a society, as, you know, Mr. Wächter, whoever he is now, no reason to come back. On the other hand, I think there's a reason to come back, because our victory is our conversation and dialogue. People are here. and the loss of everything which is standing against not moral, religious, human standards is graced through our dialogue and our thoughts and our work.
Thank you.
Maybe a question to all three of you, or maybe two questions. You mentioned now sometimes you all three are grandchildren of whatever happened at this side or the other side. Is it maybe really even now possible for the third generation to recover, to research, to have a bigger point of view on these things, that maybe the second generation was too close to it and was too much, whatever, traumatized or whatever? This would be the first question. And the second question, we are under the shelter of a religious organization now. What can religions do? What must religions do to prevent these things ever happen again in any way? Maybe I start with, I give the mic to you.
What was the first question?
This third generation, second generation.
Yes, I think for the first, really, now this generation of grandchildren is the first generation that really can work on this, because the generation like my father, they are so traumatized and they're too near to their parents somehow. It's like my father, out of love for his mother, he has to be loyal to his mother, and he can't have another opinion. And I think, and then there is also this transgenerational trauma that's going on, that's past and past, and so this generation is the one that's also near enough that we can work on it, because then the grandchildren, it's perhaps too far away, I believe. And to the second, yes.
Religion.
Yes, to the second question, I think that it's very religion is very important, and it's very important that it's not in a manichaeistic view like this Lord of the Rings. You know, there are the good and there are the bad people, and it's important that we work together, and we are. It's very important. It's dangerous. Religion can be dangerous if it is in a manichaeistic way, but if it's open to all the other religions, and so it can be a good help, I think.
I'd like to come back actually and ask you a couple of questions, because we've heard a very optimistic account from Awi. It does not accord with my experience at all, I'm afraid. And that's not said with any disrespect, but just we all have our own experiences. Sure, some people are talking about it, but very, very few people. Perhaps because I'm a courtroom lawyer and an academic who loves detail and believes that it is always the micro and the tiniest details that illuminate the greater truths. Can we have a little bit of a conversation about your cousins? Can I ask you questions? Because here we have a sort of test group, and it's sort of really interesting for me. I've been very careful to respect the privacy of those who have been in touch with me, so I don't mention names and never will. But I can give anecdotes about the kinds of things that have happened. I might be, or I was with, one of the cousins whose wife happened to have been a student of mine in the United States. And we agreed to have a dinner together. And in the course of that dinner, there was a moment when the husband, the grandchild, left the table and went to use the men's room. And at that point, the wife, my former student, turned to me and said, actually it was in relation to the film, but equally in relation to the book that was likely to be coming, could I just ask you a question, Philippe? I said, of course, absolutely anything. She said, could I just ask that you make sure that your film and book never be published in Austria? I said, why? Firstly, no, but secondly, why? To protect the children. I said, what do you mean to protect the children? And the answer that came back was, we've been very successful in keeping the Wächter name out of the spotlight. We have a young child. Do you really want to be the one who's going to expose this young child to the spotlight of association with some of these things from the past? I'll pause there and give a second example. Very shortly before the book came out, another cousin got in touch, wrote me a series of lengthy emails. And as you see, I'm a polite person, I'm not a scary person, I fight back very politely. And this cousin wrote and said, could I please ask you, Philippe, to publicly forgive my grandfather before your book is published? And I wrote back and said, thank you for writing, I really appreciate that. I'm of course going to think about this with an open mind, but I have to say I can't immediately see why I would, in the circumstances of the facts which are undisputed, I would do such a thing. However, I'm a passionate believer in reconciliation and talking. You are a man of God, you are religious, you are of the Catholic faith. I have a friend in Rome who is a cardinal, and I have a friend in Rome who is a bishop. Let's travel together to Rome, just to talk, simply to have an exchange of views, to try to see whether we can find some common ground so we can go forward in a good way rather than in a not good way. Silence. Never heard from him again. So the idea, and you have much more experience, of Avi's narrative that there is now no silence, I just don't buy it. It's not the case on the micro of the story that I've been telling. And what I'm interested to know from you, Friderica, is what's your experience within your own family, if you're able to talk about it. And I understand you may not wish to talk about it, and that's absolutely fine. On whether there is in this generation now an engagement with what happened.
Yes, I don't. Until now, nobody has come to me and really we didn't talk about this since the book was published, and so I didn't talk anymore to my family. And I know that the common sense, not everyone has this sense, but the common sense in the family is to not talk about it. And the interesting thing about this is that I've got emails from people in Austria, but also other countries who all could identify with this situation. And because they have similar situation in their families, also regarding other things, not only Nazism, and now they're inspired by my story in the book also to talk about this. And I think the most important thing to change something is in the families themselves, because of people who are not involved, they don't understand this so much. And what's also interesting is that I have now contact to other descendants of high-ranked Nazis, almost like my grandfather and further, and they also struggle to talk about this openly. And there are also one or two people there's just one person who wants to talk about it, but they can't talk about this openly. They're just at the beginning talking for themselves. But I think there's a step. The first step is to realize that there is something to be talked about. Then you can talk it. I think you have to make therapy or something to be able to talk about this, and the other step is to go out in public. And I think this step is very difficult for most people in these situations.
Although my proposal is not to go out in public, because I understand this is a very difficult and delicate step, but to have private exchanges. So to give you a third anecdote, your grandfather adopted in the spring of 1949 a false identification, a false name. Otto Wächter became Alfredo Reinhardt. And so we, our little research team, did a huge amount of research, and we were amazed to discover that there was an Alfred Reinhardt from Salzburg, senior SS individual, who was the engineer who had led the construction of Adolf Hitler's Eagle's Nest up in the mountains at Berchtesgaden. And he was active and implicated. And he had managed to escape. And he had gone to Argentina. And he had gone to a city called Salta. And we had made modest efforts to identify his successors. Again, in a very respectful way. But they had not wished to communicate. The book, as I mentioned to others, has come out in Spain in the last few weeks, or in Spain in February, but in Argentina in July. And 2 weeks ago I received an email from one of the granddaughters of Alfred Reinhardt, an Austrian from Salzburg, who had become an Argentine living in Salta. And she wrote to say, "Dear Mr. Sands, I have not read your book, but I've read numerous articles now in the Argentine press which make mention, and I can confirm that Alfred Reinhardt was my grandfather. Please write to me urgently so that we can have a conversation." Now, on receiving such an email, it wasn't clear to me what direction she would take, but again I responded and we began an exchange. And her first email back was, "My grandfather was a wonderful man." And I wondered what I should do. Do I end the exchanges, or do I send him his SS, do I send the granddaughter the SS file? Or, as a good English person, ask whether she would like me to send the SS file, which we had from Berlin. And I decided then this may not have been the right decision, or it may have been the right decision. I wouldn't ask her whether she would wish me to send her the SS file, because I didn't want, frankly, to hear no as the answer. It comes back to this question of silence. No, you need to know what your gorgeous, loving, wonderful grandfather actually did to other human beings. You've got to confront that. I'm going to send you the file. If you don't want to respond to me again, that's your prerogative, I respect that. So I sent the file, and it's not a nice file. Okay, it's really not a nice file. A thick file. And she responded immediately by saying, "Dear Mr. Sands, that there were 8 million members of the Nazi Party, and millions of people were in the SS. Everyone was doing it. I don't believe any of this stuff. My grandfather was a wonderful man." And I think, as Nicholas Frank said to me right at the beginning, very few people are like me. The vast majority are like Horst. And there's nothing, in my experience, on the reaction to the Ratline that changes my instinct, and it's not more than that Nicholas is right. That the silence is so ingrained, is so deep. The shame, the sense of protection, the anxiety, the fear, and the other factors that motivate an honest engagement with what happened, that we cannot permit ourselves to say, it's fine, we dealt with it, we've moved on. And can I just say, it's not about someone from London coming and lecturing Austrians on what they should and should not do. We've got exactly the same problem in the United Kingdom. We cannot talk about colonialism. We cannot talk about Islamophobia. We cannot talk about slavery. You can't talk about it in the United Kingdom. It's exactly the same thing. There is a silence across the generations in dealing with these issues. I confronted in East-West Street an analogous difficulty. I discovered that my grandfather, whilst in Paris, had worked for the Union Générale des Israélites Français, the UGIF. In the eyes of some, I don't know very much about the UGIF, I don't know much more now, but I know a little bit more now. In the eyes of some, the UGIF was a collaborating organisation. It was the organisation, in the eyes of some, that provided Gestapo and the Nazis with names. And so I confronted, in the book I'm very open about it, in the end, I don't know what UGIF did or didn't do, it's beyond my pay grade to do that. But if the evidence leads to my own grandfather being a collaborator, which I don't think was the case, but if that's what the evidence leads to, my duty, I think, as a grandchild, is to follow that through and confront it honestly, not hide from the truth. That's the only way within my family we could move on, if that was the case. But I think these are very personal matters, and it's certainly not for me to tell anyone else how they should or should not react to these things. But I'm really in trouble with your sentiment, because I just haven't experienced the world you're describing.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I'm quite amazed. Yeah. First, within what we call in Jewish slang, my friends, I'm considered as radical. And suddenly I'm on the other side, seeing with you. First, you said it's the detail as a scholar, as an academic. It reminds me of a quote of the late Chief Rabbi Sachs, who always quoted Arne Jacobson, who says, God lies in the detail. And God lies in the detail. And to see really the big picture from above, you have to look at the detail. So I'm going to give you the detail. And the question is here, within the details. When you hear a symphony, when you hear music, you got, sorry, I have to say it in German, and it's not so good to hear. You have Obertöne and Untertöne, you have sounds you don't hear, but they exist. And the question is which sound you're able to hear, and which sounds you want to hear. And I'm giving you, I have some of my notes on my phone, I give you some examples to all what you said, and also come to your Galip's questions and answers. First, I think it's amazing. I forgot to mention before when you told the story about Friedrichs who was, on the one hand, very Christian, and he has some Jewish roots, and he's in this thing. I don't know who knows here, or if even you know, you might know, the fame of Hundertwasser is due only and only to his Jewish Israeli promoter by the name of Harel. He's a guy, he's a genius, he's a promoter, the manager of Arik Blauer, and he's the promoter and manager of things like Hundertwasser and some other artists. And he was acting for him in New Zealand, probably you heard this from your father. Quite interesting, not your father is working up under a Jew, with a Jew. Yes. And it's closing something here, and it sounds something which is, I think, quite amazing. It's a small detail. Moving on, and coming to your question, Gali, maybe we needed this break. I mean, Avi, your father was in Auschwitz, Frederick's grandfather was there, your father was a kid here, a baby, and your grandfather, yes and no. Because you've got people like Elie Wiesel or Chief Rabbi Lau, who were also child survivors, but who started immediately to speak with a loud and clear voice. And Elie Wiesel, who said that Gleichgültigkeit, no? Vice Rector, what means Gleichgültigkeit in English? Indifference, thank you so much. Indifference is the opposite thing of love and the opposite thing of respect and so on. So indifference is, in my belief, the word which we shouldn't be anymore after the Shoah. And why I'm so positive, even not living anymore in Israel, where I thought and still think that every Jew needs to live, and it's the fulfillment of our dreams, of the Jewish dream. It is because, first, just imagine this scene. Tell your grandfather that his grandson got to sit in the heart of the Catholic Austrian Church and talking what has been done to him or to others. Think you tell my father, by the age of 11, being in the ghetto, and by 13 being in the working camp of Chabin, and by 15 being in Auschwitz, and to my mother, being with 11 in Auschwitz, that their son once with a kippah will walk in Munich, the capital of the movement, right, giving a speech to Reichskristallkugel Romanov Memorial Day, they would probably say you're totally mad. You have to go, now to madhouse. Yesterday, in the same hour, when the Austrian government, and some representatives of the Jewish community were inaugurating the new Austrian, I would more call it the Jewish Austrian, but Austrian Memorial in Auschwitz, there was dedication of the Torah scroll in the 2nd district of Vienna, with literally, and I'll show it to you later, 500 ultra-Orthodox Hasidim, who everybody of their fathers or grandfathers or great-grandfathers was persecuted or killed or beaten to the Shoah, dancing with the Torah scroll in the streets of Vienna to the former main shul of Orthodox Judaism in Vienna, the Schiff Shul, with a 96 or 94-year-old survivor by the name of Ben, who within this procession, you might have seen it in Stanford Hill, or Gold's Green, or Edge, or whatever, kids are going with big candles, torches in the streets to symbolize the light of the Torah, singing and dancing, and music. Any march of the 30s, whether in Berlin or in Moscow, wouldn't be in the same area, less loud than this one. And this Ben was holding the procession. He was giving the honor to carry or dance with the Torah. And he was making a blessing. Blessing God for the wonders which had to be done in this certain place. Experiencing all the evil, being in a concentration camp, surviving everything, coming back to Vienna. And then he was hit. After being in a concentration camp, he hid himself to liberation in 45. So if you say these are not signs of hope, I don't know what's hope. Now, and sorry, not on a personal level, but your cousins, or Mr. Alfredo's granddaughter, and all those other guys. In Germany we have 20% of the population measured anti-Semites. Who would think this? Say in Austria, I think it's 22%. Who would think this? 80 years after Auschwitz. So those 20%, they hurt me very much, and I meet them, and I guess, as not just living in Austria now, but going back and forth for 25 years between Germany, Austria, and Israel, I met more than you, and I had more experience like this. But you can choose to see the darkness, and you can choose to see the light. You can choose to see, and that's a fact, anti-Semitic Christians, atheists, Austrian, and Muslims. Or you can see the others who want to engage with you in a dialogue. Now, I switched sides. I saw the others, I felt the others, I think it's interesting. And I'll do everything in trying to push them to move to rethink their own values. But saying that this is the general society and speaking, even though it's not the same, but it's in the same tradition. Look what happened 80 years after the Shoah. Suddenly we speak about colonialism. Suddenly we speak of things giving back. Suddenly we speak to compensate Afro-American slaves or descendants of those slaves, human beings. Suddenly we speak about what's right or wrong. And at the end what we want, it's not revenge. We want to have justice. It's tzedek tirdov. Run after the justice. Run after it. So in stirring this process, for this I was also thankful of your book. I mean, on the one hand, and both books, it's nothing on the one hand which you discovered nobody knew. No, but you discovered it and you presented it in such an eloquent and amazing, enticing manner that it became a talk again. Not Lemkin, and not Lauterbach. I mean, people, they were known, but nobody really looked at it. Suddenly people looking on this. Same with the Ratline. People knew it, okay, but after your documentary, and your articles, and the book, and the fact is you are here, so we can say, okay, how many people we have? Let's say 50. As we say in German, Schein, a city of close to 2 million, we have 50 people dealing with it. But we have 50, and you're in the MAC, and you're in other places, and you've been in the Gallup's Institute, and it makes circles. It makes circles. And to ever think that any good deed, as we say in a religious term, any mitzvah, has no impact on this world, of course it has. And this is the answer to the question of religion, or morals, or being a good philosophic man, human being. Of course, if we understand that religion can create a positive aura, things will have an impact. So, on the one hand, yes, it needed time and nobody could speak. But on the other hand, people were crying out right at the second. And today more people are crying out. And whether it's Fridays for Futures, where our 10-year-old daughter in the Jewish school said, well, Papa, I think next Friday we don't go home exactly to prepare Shabbat, we're going to go for a demonstration for the earth. And I said, oh, quite interesting. He said, yeah, because the earth is the Lord's, and we have to keep our earth as a Lord. Not bad. And the same here when we speak about things like anti-Semitism, racism, homophobia, colonialism. Things are changing. So some people say that the world is, worse and that there's terrible things, trafficking and still slavery and genocide. So you deal with genocide. You're in the business of genocide. So it's hurting. But I would see the other side. Because those things has always been, on Shabbat we just read about Cain and Abel. But today people cry out and people talk. And I think that's a triumph.
Thank you, Awi. As time has proceeded, I want to do one very last question, very short answer, please, because maybe there's a time for some or two questions from the audience. We are a pedagogic university college. What do we have to give to the young people? What do we have to give to the students? What have we to give to the future generation to keep, let's make it a resume, to keep the process going on and make it more open and stop the silence more and bring more out the truth and the things that go on. Maybe I start this time with Awi. We do it in another way around.
So first let me show that just want to mention the UGF which you mentioned. It's not just an Austrian, French topic, there's also Austrian topic, there's a Polish topic about Jugendrechte. We have this famous film of called Landsmann, The Last of the Just, or The Last of the Unjust, with Merlechen. So it's a topic, by the way, I don't think your grandfather and the UGF have been collaborators, but it's a question important to us. And that's exactly the question that we have to put for the students. Why things like the Shoah, or justice at all, which would more serve your topic at all, why justice is so important? and not giving the answers, but giving them the questions to which they should find the answers, together with us, the professors, the intellectuals, the so-called intellectuals, the thinkers. This will give maybe a direction to the solution, and not the final one, but the one to make mankind, as we say each day in our prayers, within a tikkun, which is a recreation in the face of God.
I think, in thinking about your question, Galib, the crucial issue for me is why we're having this conversation at all. I don't think we're having this conversation because we have some sort of esoteric interest of what happened in the past. What we really care about is understanding what happened in order to make sure it doesn't happen again, or at least limiting the prospects of it happening again. And I think the state of the world today, and I can't speak for Austria, obviously I'm merely a visitor, but I can speak of the countries where I do live, the United Kingdom and France. It is plain that there is a problem. It is plain that the demonization of the other continues. It is plain that there is hatred of Islam, and there is hatred of Jews, and there is hatred of trans people, and there is hatred of gays, and a myriad of other human beings, individuals and groups. And I suppose the answer to your question, Galib, for me, is that we have to have an honest conversation about what has happened in the past, in the hope that having that conversation allows us to better understand the kinds of conditions that give rise to what occurred in the past and what, in my world, is going on now, whether it's the Rohingya or the Uyghurs or the Yazidis or other parts of the world. It hasn't stopped. We didn't invent the concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide and then find, oh, all of a sudden everyone's behaving really well to each other. It hasn't stopped. So, the absence of silence, and people who know me know that I'm an intensely optimistic person, intensely optimistic. But I think we have to be honest. The cup is always half full for me too. But we need to recognise the danger signs. We need to recognise the danger signs that are around us. And my fear is that silence creates the conditions in which we cannot learn and take account of those signs. And so for the next generation, I would say quite simply, challenge us. This generation, my generation, which has let you down so terribly, and which has left the world, frankly, in a shocking state. We can't be optimistic and say, with our hands on our hearts, that when my generation came to adulthood 30 or so years ago, what we have done with our stewardship of our societies has left you in a better place. Plainly, that has not happened. So my answer to your question is that it is for the younger generation to challenge us, and to challenge us brutally on what we have got wrong. And one of the things that we have got wrong is that we tolerated silence.
Yes, and I think silence is always bad because it's also a tool to suppress people. So if it's like in mafia clans, there is silence and corruption and political groups and conspirational groups. So I think if the individual is suppressed by the silence, it cannot be a good member of a democratic society. And because of people, they want to defend their silence and want to blame others, that's a root for racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and all these things. And because of that, I think that it's so important to get to learn young people to have civil courage and to question everything, and that there's a culture of listening and questioning and talk in open discussions, and also the understanding of multiple identities. For example, I'm not just Muslim, I'm also half Swedish, half Austrian, and someone can have multiple identities. And a multiculturalism is something good. It can be so good, like there is a book about the university in Vienna. It was one of the most high-ranking universities in the world, in the monarchy, before the Second World War. And then, because of this right-wing extremists, because of these horrible things, now it's never recovered from all of this. And I think we see how important it is that, yes, all this this discussion and being together as democracy.
Thank you very much to hear Ms. Ring. The time is already, the planned time is already run out, but I want maybe to give the opportunity to have a few questions. I think there will be a lot of, and we could sit here for 4 hours, but some very burning, but some, or maybe the one who was first, who will be first. I will give the mic then to you, if somebody has a question.
I'm doing the Holocaust education for many years at the University College and also at the University of Vienna. And my experience is then when students have their first unit to do is to make an interview with the oldest members of the family. What is the narrative of the Second World War? How did they talk about the elders from the family? What is the narrative? And I see more and more that it became the fourth generation, that they are in fear asking questions. They say, I have to protect my grandma or grandpa because I see that they don't want to talk. And the next generation won't have anybody to ask. So I think we must break the silence in the family for being able to talk in the society. Because if you are not able to talk in your own family, you are not able to make a real discussion and not superficial discussion in the society. My question now is, when we don't have the possibility anymore to talk because there are nobody to talk to, how should we then break the silence?
This is another question, then we would collect it and maybe just only with one round of questions.
Okay, so
Ja, nicht fragen.
In der Corona-Zeit, in der wir leben, haben Leute jetzt gelernt, gehorsam zu sein. Wie kann in so einer Atmosphäre die Sensibilisierung für Gerechtigkeit lauter werden, obwohl es so viel Gehorsamkeit der neuen Generation ist?
Yeah. Whoever wants to respond.
On your question, I think we're reaching, well, there's a point of no return. That generation is just about to disappear. The people who are able to recall are about to be no longer with us. I've just finished making on BBC Radio 4 program on the legacy of Nuremberg. the 75th anniversary of the judgment is this week. It will be broadcast, I think, next week or the week after. And I, because of the work that I do, have got to know many people who were involved in the Nuremberg process in various ways. And I interviewed 3 of the last people alive, literally, who were participants in the Nuremberg process. And it's a very moving and humbling thing to do. The number of people who can say, I was in the room, I was in courtroom 600. Perhaps the most moving conversation that I had was with Benjamin Ferentz, who's 101 years old. He was a prosecutor in the Einsatzgruppen trials. And he said, not on the record, I really worry for you. I really worry when people like me aren't around anymore. And I spoke to Robbie Dundas, the daughter of the presiding judge. A remarkable story to tell. She was 21 in 1945. She was working at Bletchley Park, British intelligence service, and she was sent to Nuremberg to interview Jodl and Keitel about certain documents. And she never told them that she was the daughter of the presiding judge. And she then sat in on the trial for a week, which happened to be the week they showed the documentary films of the liberation of Belsen and other places, a very famous film. She said, I have never for a day not thought about sitting in court on that day. It has lived with me for 75 years. And I interviewed the assistant to the French judge, Yves Beigbeder, 95 years old, who sat in on the entire trial for 6 months and was there when Hans Frank accepted a degree of responsibility, and he was still there 3 months later when Hans Frank retracted his acceptance of responsibility. I don't know how to answer your question, because once those voices are silenced, there's going to be no one who can say, this is what happened and I was there. This is very personal to me in a sense, because my mother, who was born in Vienna in July 1938, left in July 1939, and then spent 4.5 years as a child hidden in various Catholic families on the outskirts of Paris, and was saved by those extraordinary people. She doesn't remember anything. I say to her, what were they like? What was it like? She says, I can't remember. And the processes, the psychological processes that cut in to stop you being damaged forever by what you have experienced, she cannot remember anything that happened. So she is really the last, pretty much the last generation, and she doesn't remember firsthand. She remembers the stories after the war and things that were said, but it's qualitatively different. Nothing beats, which is why I think, in a sense, the next generations have a particular responsibility to speak so loudly. And I used to think, or used to experience, that it was my side of the story that had the responsibility to talk out, but I've now come to realize, having met Horst and Nicholas and Friderica and Francesca, that that side is just as important. We have to hear those stories. And my experience is exactly as yours. Just as it was for me being an 8 or 9 year old child in Paris at my grandparents' apartment and being told not to ask certain things. And for 40 years, I never asked a single question. I never even asked, I said this last night, what I'm often asked, what's my greatest regret? I never even asked the question to my grandfather, what was your mother like? Because even that was impermissible, because it was such a painful question. So I worry that we are about to enter that moment, which will be seized upon by the forces of darkness to ramp up the argument that these things didn't happen, or if they did happen, they weren't quite so bad, or actually it wasn't so many people, or this, that, or the other. Because it's much easier to spin that narrative when there isn't someone there who can say, I was there, I saw what happened, as Benjamin Ferentz did on the radio, and say, I was at Bergen-Belsen, I saw for myself what happened, I was in that place. So I think it's a very dangerous moment.
Basically, I agree on the one hand, but still on the other hand, and I mean, it sounds like the poem of Paul Celan, Niemand zeugt für den Zeugen, nobody's witnessing for the witness. On the other hand, I again want to take up the outcry of Elie Wiesel, who said, be the witness of the witnesses. And I want to take up Rabbi Lau, who said, you listen to my stories, please move on telling those stories as truth always prevails. And as a religious Jew, who's each year sitting on Pesach, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and saying those words which our Haggadah, our storybook is telling us, B'chol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo kilu yatsa v'Mitzrayim. In each generation, each person is obliged to see himself as he, by his own personal experience, went out of Egypt. So we have quite a good tradition of telling stories, and people move on with the stories. You probably might know the book of Michael Waltz about Exodus and Revolution. 3,000 years later, the Afro-American slaves in America took up this story, and it helped them to liberate partially themselves. So I think this is our obligation for the future, in telling our story and being a witness of the witness. And this is exactly what you're doing. And I have to admit, Philippe, you're doing it brilliantly. You're doing it very elusive. And you're doing it very inspiring. For this, am I afraid? Of course I'm afraid. I was not afraid due to, my mother passed away, my father passed away, my grandmother passed away a week after I made Aliyah to Israel in 1992. So yeah, I'm very afraid. But on the other hand, even though if I go in the valley of death, I'm not afraid. Because not just God, but their stories are with me. So that's one. And what you said about the other, Judaism is everything about being proud and able to be the other, without that others make the other bad or good. Just, you're the other, Frederica's the other, you like blue shirts, I like blue shirts, obviously, Andreas is wearing a white one. Fine enough with us. We respect each other. So therefore, also, my angst, my fear are different. Because I might see, and again, I might see the possible good things, as strong as the bad things shine from beyond. I'll be able to take the fire, as Elie Wiesel tells the story, within out the ashes, to light up my way for the future.
Yes, I wanted to also to say it now when this is also a responsibility we have as descendants of the perpetrators and also descendants of the victims, that if there are no victims left who can talk about it, it's even more important that we are talking about it.
As a bad moderator, I now have to stop it here. Thank you very, very much for this. I think everybody's very touched in the room, and thank you all three for giving us the time together. And I want to end up with maybe it's a little bit more banal, but I know Awi is a musician, Philippe is very deep into music, Friderica loves musician. I'm a music therapist, so I have to end with something from music also. And I was, the last 2 weeks, I had some crying nights, evenings, when Frederick was always in bed, and I put on the YouTube because I was listening to the new songs of ABBA. You know, suddenly these old angel voices are here again from the time when the sky was blue and the grass was green and ABBA was here, you know. And the voice of the mommy angel is back again. It's back again. And I know, you know, Philippe, he likes very much Leonard Cohen, and I like very much this anthem song also, where this wonderful verses. There's a crack in everything, and that's where the light gets in. And it's obvious, I found it's also a sentence from Mevlana Rumi. I can put inside some Islamic things also, which it's a very nice sentence. And I don't want to finish with ABBA, because ABBA is perfect music, it's high-rank music for if you listen exactly. But on the other thing, it's very banal and very broad. And it's a very nice, the second new song has the last line of the second new song is, I've learned to cope, and love and hope is why I'm here now.